Brookfield is pleased to partner with The Urbanist on Monocle Radio. Brookfield manages real estate around the globe, collaborating with partners, tenants and local communities to bring Brookfield's properties to life. Being part of the wider Brookfield ecosystem affords access to data and expertise across a breadth of industries, in addition to access to capital. A leading portfolio of real estate, with a proven record of adding value beyond the buildings. Success built on relentless innovation, leading-edge sustainability, and the highest standards of design. The creation of places that enhance the very fabric of our communities. Brookfield, real estate reimagined.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up,
we need to think back to, okay, what are we actually doing? What do we need these spaces for?
I just remember going to places where people were frantically putting in bars and sort of alcohol was the answer.
To be in the boardroom talking about the value of the culture, the warp and weft of that organisation is absolutely how it should be.
How does an office earn the commute? With a recent survey showing that UK workers continue to work from home more than nearly any of their global counterparts, we wanted to uncover why that might be the case. To do so, we assembled a team of experts in our London studios who discussed the UK capital as a case study for the need to design better workspaces. They mused on how to get our city centre humming again, discussed how to curate company culture, and imparted some wisdom to other centres who want to entice their workforces back into the CBD. Our guests were Rachel Edwards, Future of Work lead at real estate company Lend Lease, Andrew Palmer, management columnist for The Economist, and Helen Beresford, partner and lead of IDSR, the interior design group at architecture firm Shepherd Robson. Guiding the conversation was Monocle's head of radio and host of The Entrepreneurs, Tom Edwards. And I'll hand it over to him now. Here you go, Tom.
It's wonderful to have you all here. Thanks for coming to chat to us. Why is it important to go to the office? Andrew, it's been a bit of a tale, hasn't it, post-2020? Where are we at, just before we sort of get into the nuts and bolts, in that discourse around the essentialism of the office? Because if you go back to sort of 21, 22, many advocates said, well, look, this is proof positive that we don't need it. Lots of the big companies, property developers and so forth, they were kind of sitting tight. Where are we at now? Do you think we're at this point where we're broadly, is there an alignment? Is there a bit of a consensus?
In terms of sort of hybrid working, remote working patterns, it looks like we're settled into something of a range. I mean, I wouldn't say it's like settled for good, but hybrid working is clearly much higher than it was pre-pandemic. It varies from country to country. So the UK is particularly high, actually. Not the highest, but high in terms of the amount of working from home that goes on. There is a very, very heated row in the US in particular about return to office mandates. So it's still a subject that causes an awful lot of heat and light. But actually, behaviourally, I think we're probably settled.
And is that kind of your take as well, Rachel? Do you think that we're sort of over the constant discussion and now we can get stuck into the kind of the nuts and bolts of not just the efficacy of it or the philosophy behind it, but what we actually do to make great places that people want to come to and be creative and be together?
We all want cities that have fun, vibrant, social, economic activity happening in them. And offices will always be centre to that because that's where work happens. But I think that this movement was happening before the pandemic. People have been working very differently for a long time now. It's just that through this, especially the bigger organisations, have started to see the impact on real estate in particular, which causes this discussion. But our role as developers is ultimately making sure that with these massive swathes of city centre district, we're delivering something that helps that long-term vision for the city. So as you can imagine, we sort of have I'm going to call it terrifying privilege of delivering places that will exist for decades and centuries to come. So have to take a really long look forward at what industries will be around. And we're really seeing that actually it's not just the hybrid profile that's changing ways of working, but many, many, many different factors, least of which is technology. So AI is changing the way that businesses operate and ultimately changing the way that organisations partner with academia, with government, with public bodies to help move industries forward. So that to me has a really big impact on how we're designing places of work in the city centre. I think it will continue to move.
Well, that's funny. And actually, Helen, it strikes me that from what Rachel was saying there, we talk about the pandemic as if it sort of changed everything. It was an accelerant in many ways. Talk about the rise of technology or digitalisation. And of course, in this space, it accelerated lots of trends that were already there. Tell us a bit about your work and how lots of the things that you're still preoccupied with and trying to innovate and progress around were actually there before. Okay, maybe they sped up, but they were there and you're just building. It is much longer term.
I think it's fascinating. I mean, we do come at the understanding of offices very much from the people, the culture, the organisation. So I must admit, I'm in the boardroom more than ever at the moment. And, to be in the boardroom talking about what we're doing in the workplace, the value of the culture, the warp and weft of that organisation is absolutely how it should be. And I think there was always an interest sort of prior to, the last 5 years in terms of let's get the right property if you're going to move. And when an organisation was looking to go to one of Rachel's wonderful places of work to secure a deal for 15, 20 years, there would be interest in the boardroom. But now, the complexity of being interested in ESG, wellness, getting people back to work. To me, it's what it always was, but the level of interest and engagement at senior level has just absolutely multiplied. I mean, we do quite a lot of data analysis on occupation, and it's been quite busy recently, as you might imagine. But when you start to look at the levelling out, I think it's absolutely, as you say, that the numbers are actually panning out to be pretty similar, different in different sectors, but pretty similar to pre-5 years ago. But we're just much more aware of it and much more nuanced as to what you can provide and the value you can provide by the place that you bring people to, whether it's outside or inside. And I think the fascinating thing about now is that there's a blend and there's a merger between our cities outside and our cities inside.
Well, Andrew, let me talk about that. A couple of words there. Long-termism, talking about nuance, talking about complexities. All of these themes that we've just even touched upon, alluded to very briefly. So many stakeholders, often with very conflicting interests. Where are we at? Give us a bit of an overview, a macro view, if you like, in terms of trying to align, make sense of and untangle all of those different points of view and vested interests, particularly given we're talking about 15, 20-year time horizons. Lots of the public servants won't even be around then. Lots of the corporate leaders won't either. Where are we in that sort of narrative?
Well, as I say, I think in terms of if you think about the allocation of people, remote work, fully in the office, hybrid, that feels like it's settling and it sort of moves between industries and companies. So the nature of the debate, I guess, has changed. So right at the beginning, there was a kind of everyone needs to come into the office to kind of socialise, know each other. This is where you collaborate. And so I just remember going to places where people were frantically putting in bars and sort of alcohol was the answer to how you get people back. Now it seems like it's a bit more subtle. The conversations around culture, newcomers versus people who've been there and already have social capital. Interestingly, some survey evidence suggesting that people are coming to the office in order to do focused work when very initially people sort of thought you'd be at home to do the focused work. So I guess it's just become a slightly more nuanced discussion from that point of view. And then, of course, within industries, you'll have different firms competing on this. So JP Morgan is 5 days back to the week. Citigroup is very clearly leaning into we are doing working from home. So there will be a market based on working patterns and employers can play into that. So you'd assume that would continue. Can I ask one question of my own?
Of course you can. It's a round table. That's what we're here to do.
All right. Okay. So both Helen and Rachel said that it's really important to have cities kind of being vibrant and the beating heart. I totally agree with that myself. But couldn't you redistribute economic activity around cities in different ways? And cities can be just as successful, but it's a spider's web rather than something right in the centre.
At the beginning of this year, the Mayor of London released the London Growth Plan, which is exactly as you've said. So they're really looking at how the next 10 years evolves in London with the view that we're trying to bring in big growth for the UK, and London has always been at the heart of driving that. But the way it's been mapped out is this sort of view of a polycentric city. So where are all the different types of activities? What are those activities? What sits within your kind of destinational social type activity, and where does that cross-pollinate with what we would view as your workplace? And so I think we're probably at the beginning of really understanding what that means, but it should create a really good map for driving that. And the other side of that is, I mentioned before, this sort of shift towards more interaction between academia and research and public policy makers and government with industry to help drive those forwards, particularly in the UK, looking to attract businesses working in frontier innovation. That's sort of setting up for growth. And the way that that's sort of been tapped into is there's tens of different areas which have been tagged as economic activators. But to really understand how we can create an impact, they've created essentially corridors of activity and looking at how to tie those corridors together.
Because you assume that the sort of like the beating heart of the city is what everyone kind of wants to see. But in theory, you don't need to have that, do you?
I think it depends. I mean, I think the interesting thing is we have spent a period of time in our 15-minute cities, which has made a difference to our locality, and that suburban life has, even if you're sort of fairly central, has kind of flourished. But I think that there is always that intensity of the really civic places. I think what's happening in the central zones is that it's not just, West End and City, say, and then a bit of Canary Wharf for offices. You're now looking at sort of Paddington, you're now looking at Slough, you're now looking at Hammersmith. There are all these villages that I think London's actually quite interesting for because it's always had villages, but the idea that more variety happens within those spaces. And even the city itself, we're moving a large bank back into the city from Canary Wharf at the moment, and it's, one of the big things they wanted to do was move close to their original home and move into a building that was definitely a refurbished building and reinvented building. But you look at what the city is with talking about archeries running from Barbican right the way down to the Tate Modern. There's an amazing cultural content in the city now. So 10 years ago, maybe it was a little bit more all about big shiny towers and offices being, these great big statements. Now the variety, one of the things that when we're talking in the boardroom or with the teams, is they're wanting to know what the city offers them in comparison to their previous, the Canary Wharf offer. And it's just so exciting. And then every time, you never get bored of the city, I found myself finding out more about things that I thought I knew really well in the city. That discovery is so brilliant that you can still find things now that you didn't know, previously.
Can we interrogate that a bit more? Because I find it really interesting, this idea that there are these intangibles, talking about culture, the opportunities for serendipity, discourse meeting, and places that foster creativity. These are very nuanced, they're quite abstract. Maybe the office always was the fulcrum for all of these complex and nuanced interrelationships, but maybe just the discourse has caught up with the reality, if you like?
So I think the culture that enables people to be creative and entrepreneurial and, have moments for these sort of vibrant sparks of cross-pollination is really important. But actually, as more and more organisations are realising, is that things like well-being, things like knowledge, learning, upskilling is really important, especially just now when things are moving so quickly. And they're all human factors. So to me, the way that things are evolving are not the sort of 9 to 5, you're in a place, breakfast, lunch and evening. You are very much embedded in a place whenever you go there. And there's more sort of to the point of bringing in more leisure and cafes and bars and that sort of thing. People being attracted into places where they can go and be part of this sort of more mixed use cultural experience to spark those very human creative things. Actually, coming back to the academic piece too, if you look at Stratford, for example, has just opened East Bank on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. So it sort of brings together this mix of like sport and culture and creativity alongside business and innovation. But something really interesting that they've done there is they've appointed a director of East Bank. And her role is to make sure that all of those organisations, so UCL East, College of Fashion, V&A, Sadler's Wells, BBC, they're all talking to one another. But she runs a programme that opens up their programming to the public, as well as to one another. So if I were a business there, I would not only have access to my business, but it encourages me to get out during the workday to go to these talks about things that may be outside my typical realm to help me upskill, learn, meet other people, cross-pollinate. Your sort of daytime experience is not just with your organisation then, it's with all of those institutions and other organisations and the public who have access into them.
And then you get this incredible mutual enrichment that can happen, hopefully, if it's done correctly. Andrew, I know you wanted to weigh in.
Well, I was just thinking about as a specific measure of creativity, which is entrepreneurship. The evidence kind of points interestingly in both ways. So there's papers that show that things like the existence of a Starbucks is very heavily correlated and seems to be causally related to numbers of startups that are then formed in an area. So places where you can meet other people and have conversations is really important. The other side of this, there's a new paper just out, really interesting, which shows that higher levels of remote working is correlated with higher levels of entrepreneurship, because it looks like people can work on their side hustles with the shelter of a salaried job and the time spared by not commuting from home. So both things are possible. You can make arguments in both ways, basically.
And do they need to exist separately, or can they exist together?
I think both could
Is that-
exist,
yeah?
and presumably you have your good idea. You still need to go to the Starbucks at some point. But there's an argument for both places where you coalesce and congregate and talk, but also time and financial security to think about entrepreneurship.
I wonder if we can get a little bit more granular, get some examples. And Helen, intrigued to sort of tap into your knowledge base here. What about trends in specifics? What are people looking to do? Let's look at the details of specific fit outs. Do the things you see, what clients are challenging you to do, does that align with some of these broader trends that we've been observing? Maybe give us some examples.
Most definitely. I think the office being somewhere where you learn, where you're entrepreneurial, where you really encourage a variety of activity between different generations as well is so significant. But to get more specific, when we were working with Deloitte on their campus in New Street Square, and they described it as a campus. They originally had 6 different buildings. There were 6 different places that different partners had chosen to make their mark on the organisation. When we were involved in the campus, they were rationalising the numbers of buildings and then creating one New Street Square that had all that variety within, one building, in fact 2 buildings. They built a bridge across to number 2. But within that, they had a coffee shop of their own, Benugo's. They basically had that right on the ground floor, so you could come in and you'd meet so many people in the organisation informally in Benugo's. Then off that space, you slid back a door and their SME space was just next door. So they had very intelligently encouraged, Deloitte curated, and I think there is a lot of curation with this. There's accidental, but it's also curation and allowing permission. And there's nothing like giving people space and time. So, carving out a piece of your valuable real estate and say, this is where the new generation of ideas can come from. You can come and use this space. We'll sponsor you. Don't worry about rent, etc. Come up with your wonderful idea. And in fact, in Deloitte, we'll then support your business growth with that idea. And off we go. And when you take an organisation like that, they are competing with all sorts. They're competing with Google as much as anybody else in terms of their cohort. But they knew very much that providing a space to get together, learn, sometimes informal, sometimes formal, curating a lot of that interaction in a professional sense brought the better graduates in. It really was quite methodical, their approach to creating a University of Deloitte as much as an office that you might traditionally think of. And so I think there's quite a sophistication with a number of organisations where they are planning for that variety and then creating the opportunity. And that's where we come in and have fun and design different places to allow that to happen.
And that's fascinating. I think this idea of the pivot to mixed use is obviously something we see and we talk about often. I guess because we have to think more about environmental impact, sustainability, cost, efficiency, efficacy. Rachel, we can't just plan every project from the ground up to deliver that. Often we need to look at retrofitting, and we're talked around Canary Wharf to the city, some people moving. Obviously there is this tower in Canary Wharf that may be sort of reimagined to be more mixed use. Are we getting good enough, quick enough at being creative and adaptable, even with very established buildings, neighbourhoods? Because that's a similar but different challenge with its own attendant problems.
I think we as an industry are definitely trying to be. What struck me with that is that there's a big focus on porosity and that adaptability to be, I think we're talking about, having different uses over different times of day and then over different uses over different years. But that porosity says so much in terms of enabling that, because it means that you can move the security lines, you can open up spaces to different people on different days. And it goes further than that in that it creates that dynamic between coming to social impact, the dynamic between the organisation and being able to interact with its local community to uplift it. And there's lots more going on between organisations wanting to work with the local communities. And I'll use Euston, for example. One of our projects is the HS2 oversight, a massive chunk, about 60 acres of central Zone 1 London. but next to an area which has one of the most deprived communities in London, next to an area which is a massive STEAM hub. DeepMind are there, Google, Facebook, these massive organisations. And so there's a lot more work being done to make sure that that sort of ground floor, first floor podium sort of level has more activities and flexibility to be able to interact with not just businesses, community, startups, scale-ups, as you were talking about Deloitte, but also school children. How do you start to create that cross-pollination so that we're educating our next generation of talent from that really young age?
Andrew, editorialise a little bit for me. We talk about lots of these complexities and conflicting interests, and yet lots of similar objectives and some similar narratives, whether you're talking about development or planning, civic governance and all the rest of it. Lots of these things will spark tensions. Are these good, healthy, creative tensions, the kinds of things that have always made cities dynamic and exciting and full of energy? Or do we need other structures, frameworks, oversight to ensure that the tensions don't spiral or we don't misapply scarce resources? What's your sort of personal take on it?
I mean, it doesn't strike me that we need some great new way of running cities as a result of what we're seeing. There are obvious problems with you have spirals of if enough people leave, then spending goes down, tax goes down, and so obviously you want to prevent that. I don't see that as being a problem particularly here. I think probably the kind of, it's going back to the talk of corridors or different hubs. It's like, how do you make that work? So if you look at things that people spend their money on if they're working from home, they spend their money on groceries. That's where the incremental spend is. So like suburban supermarkets do really well out of working from home, but there aren't cultural activities, or if there are, that's not where people are spending their money. And in America, people are tending to spend their time at home, right? That's how they relax. They don't go out and socialise. They don't volunteer. That extra time spent from commuting, if they're not setting up a business, is spent watching Netflix or on their own, or and potentially that's not great. So I would say maybe that's the thing that people need to think about. Is like, what's the set of coherent, attractive kind of social spaces everywhere around the city? And I guess London does well at that just because we're already a set of villages, as you say, but I'm sure there must be cities which just can't replicate that.
I think sometimes there can be a touch of curation of that. I mean, I was particularly thinking of our own organisation that's been in Parkway and Camden for 50 years, and we're on probably our third lease event during that time, and we were about to be moved out. Our old piano warehouse has had some tremendous reusage in its history, but at the time when King's Cross was developing apace and Google was potentially coming in and still are in the area but not in their main building. Huge pressure on our little office, and there was a thought to turn it into residential. So we started looking around for another home. During that time, Camden Borough decided that they didn't want to lose 300 people from the local environment in terms of an office infrastructure in a quite small space, very dense, lots of architects on top of each other. They didn't want to lose that from the community, so they wouldn't let the planning change. So although there's a lot of ebb and flow across the city, and London is brilliant because you wouldn't have the reinvention of the square mile now if people hadn't spread out and gone to different parts of the city and gone to Canary Wharf. But sometimes I think there can be some creative control of what does happen. So we loved it because we then ended up working with the owner of the building and redeveloping the site and getting a bit more space on the site, shaping it to what we wanted for the next 10, 15 years. And we're still there and we love it. There's a bit of magic about being architects. It's our home and the space is very expressive of that. So we were delighted that piece of fortune, came our way. So I think you wouldn't want to be draconian about that managing, but I think sometimes you need to have an overview that allows a bit of curation of variety, because if that had turned into posh residential, it just wouldn't have been the same.
And I guess it comes back to your point, Andrew, which is actually then maybe some of those safeguards, frameworks, they've got a bit of flexibility. There's a bit of room for some curation and creativity, but actually they are there. Maybe we don't need to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just to nudge us towards a conclusion, obviously we're in London, we all work in London, we're talking about London, lots of London's buildings and great practices and ideas and bits of villagey placemaking. How mindful should our global audience be that, one always needs to pivot certain assumptions, objectives, ambitions to specific markets? London is a big megacity. It has its attendant challenges, but also opportunities. But how do we ensure that whatever the project, we're doing the old thing of thinking globally and acting locally? Rachel, how does that work with different projects, even within the UK, but certainly more broadly? How do you ensure that you're getting outside the kind of London bubble? Or are there lessons actually that would be
useful for other great cities to learn from London?
It's a really good question. You'd sort of say that every response needs to be bespoke to the city it's in, the community that it's within. This is still a UK example, but we've got a project in Birmingham that for all our big urban region that has a serious officers component, we do have a sort of model where we look at bringing together those big stakeholder partners with the government, academia, etc., and build a governance around it and proactive. I call it the hardware and the software. So we're delivering the physical, but we're also delivering the softer relationships within it. And that is a sort of model that brings that diversity, etc. But looking outside that in Birmingham, we were sort of saying, okay, well, we work with the London Growth Plan in London. We have a serious understanding of what is sort of needed here. So we did a sort of mapping exercise there and having conversations with stakeholders across the region, across the city to understand what they needed and what's most valuable for that area. And, in mixed use, that can balance in many, many different ways. But what I will say to that is expectations around lifestyles, local challenges, they're all very, very different no matter where you go. There's obviously themes that can be similar, but the Office of the Future has a bigger role than people realise in how it interacts with that community.
Andrew Palmer, what's your take on this? Are there things that you chronicle and write about which are pretty universal, whatever city you're in? Or are you confounded or surprised by the experience? You might only travel a couple of few hundred miles and be like, wow, this is completely different than what I was expecting. How does that work?
So I guess, I totally think you're right, Rachel, that every city is going to have its own challenges. The obvious thing to take from London is that public transport works here and buses are great and it's all connected, right? And you go to Leeds and you just can't get from one side of the city to the other as easily. So that's an obvious thing to take. And the universal threads are probably within the office. It's people are all trying to think about what is the office for? You use the word curation a lot, Helen, and I guess that's the big difference from before the pandemic. People think about this much more now, right? It's like, what are we doing? Why are people in the office? So there's much more interest in that kind of socialization, culture. What kind of culture are we trying to build? Does working from home suit it, or actually is it against it? So, firm like SpaceX, Elon Musk companies, you're in. And you're in for like 80 hours a week, and that is intentional. And then other places are going to be much more interested in work-life balance and how that feeds through to employees. So I guess the universal thread is just everyone is thinking about this harder.
But we're beyond the Taylorist approach, I think. I think some of the organisations you mentioned where Sarah draws a desk and you will be in and I can only manage you if I can see you. I think you can skive a lot more easily at a computer than you can, when you're not in the office. I think thinking about your output and your teams in a much broader sense, you will get more than just a clerical Taylorist sort of 19th century dynamic from your teams. And I think to survive, we've got to be a lot more than just transactional in that way or dictatorial.
And I think to your main point on Taylorism, if you look back to the 1700s, the purpose of the office was the coffee houses and then to store paper because of a paper-heavy economy. And so now we need to think back to, okay, what are we actually doing? What do we need these spaces for? And stop having a presenteeism culture where people are at desks, where actually it has a negative impact on how we work because we have all the tools to have the freedom to choose the setting that we're working in and who we're working with and where it is.
That's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. My thanks to Rachel Edwards, Andrew Palmer and Helen Beresford for their time and their insights, and also to our host, Tom Edwards too. The Urbanist is produced by Carla Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits this show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.
On The Urbanist, we're always asking what makes a city truly livable. This September, find some answers in Barcelona as Monocle hosts its annual Quality of Life conference. 3 days of panels, ideas and good conversation with global mayors, architects and policy pioneers, all over good food and a glass of something local. Find out more and book your seat at monocle.com/conference.